Hi, my name is Brandon Barton. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Mississippi State University. I'm an ecologist. I study food webs, terrestrial food webs, and how climate change and other aspects of environmental change are affecting these things. I was really excited to come and meet you all and see the work you're doing and share this work with you. But of course, the pandemic has made that impossible right now. Funny enough, even though I'm from far away, I'm actually right here in Ontario right now, which is, I think, part of the reason I was excited about coming to visit you. Is we spend our summers in Algonquin Park, and I was looking forward to driving over and making some new friends. We can't do that now, but maybe next year things will be better, and I can beg for another invitation to come meet you in person. Real quick, a little bit about me. I wanted to just share this with you. This is where we spend our time here in Algonquin, and I've spent the last several weeks trying to work from our cottage in the park. If you're ever on Cache Lake or you're ever in the area, it'd be great to visit. The other thing I want to share with you is that I've recently become the editor of this journal, Food Webs. Still a relatively new journal. We don't have an impact factor yet. We're applying for that right now. But we've had some really cool papers. We also have some really cool sections that are different than many journals. For example, we have a natural history section. So we accept notes on natural history observations that are not just novel, but also expand our understanding of how food webs work. And so there's been some really cool natural history observations that we've published. I would love it if any of you have appropriate work, email me or otherwise communicate with the journal and consider us for your next publication. My lab I sometimes describe as studying ecology and the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a word that many people aren't familiar with. It's actually technically not officially a thing yet. It's a proposed geological epoch that's describing the time period in geological time that the humans have had significant impacts on the world. And so basically we're talking about the last couple hundred years. My lab is pretty diverse. I started out at the University of Idaho as a wildlife major, and so I've always had an interest in sort of an applied and conservation angle in my research and with vertebrates and wildlife, even though it's not all that I do or the most of my work. We just graduated a student who studied gopher tortoises, these really neat ecosystem engineers in the southern United States, looking at how fire affects them, and not just fire, but the timing of fire. Humans, for different reasons, are changing the timing of fire. So we want to understand, how does that human influence on the environment, the abiotic environment, affect these really cool and in some places endangered tortoises. We've done work on white-tailed deer. I've graduated 2 students now studying white-tailed deer, different aspects of that, and have an ongoing project on baiting. Humans putting out food, they're changing the environment, and how does that affect the behavior and the interactions of this species with other species? A big part of my lab has become this idea of mass mortality events. This is not a picture I took. This is actually a site that's now got some publications. People have studied this event. This was more than 100 reindeer that were struck by lightning. What's the implication of these mass deaths? It turns out they're happening more frequently. My lab is taking a slightly different approach. We've been doing experiments where we actually put out carcasses. We use feral swine that are an invasive species and a big problem. But there's lots of reasons, and they're caused by humans, many of them, that these mass mortality events, hundreds or thousands of animals dying at once, are occurring. And we want to know what happens when that does occur. If you're interested in any of that, we haven't published a ton of it actually because it's sort of very long-term experiments, but there's been some great articles written in popular magazines. If you're interested, or of course you could contact me and I'd love to talk more about it. But we're interested again in these indirect effects. I don't have time to talk about mass mortality event work today, and some of you might be relieved because it is pretty gross stuff. You can't smell it, but the images from some of these experiments are pretty dramatic. What I want to talk to you about today is the role of predators in mediating these effects of global change, how predators can cause cascading effects throughout an ecosystem. So I broke the talk into 3 general parts. First, I just want to give you a background on climate change and predators, which haven't always got a lot of attention in climate change research. Then we'll talk about some specific examples about how warming can affect predator behavior and how that change in their behavior can generate these indirect effects. And then I've left this a bit vague, but I want to talk to you about some other effects of global change and get you thinking about how climate change is affecting ecosystems in really complicated ways, and in ways that really we're not even thinking about yet. And maybe we're thinking about them, but we certainly don't understand the implications of these other types and nuances of climate change and global change. This is probably a figure that some of you have seen, or you've seen something like it. And it's similar to the hockey stick curve showing increasing CO2 concentrations over time. I hope you're familiar with this idea. I assume most of you are, but in case you aren't, the story goes that CO2 levels had been relatively constant for quite some time, and then the Industrial Revolution happened, and we created these modern combustion engines, and they're producing lots and lots of greenhouse gases. Those go into the atmosphere and have effects. What's amazing is the rate of change and the levels that we are now at, and how long it's been since we were at those levels in the past. In 2000, I believe it was 2015, we crossed the threshold of 400 parts per million. That's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The last time our atmosphere had that much carbon dioxide in it, humans had not even evolved or began to evolve as a species. We'd have to go back almost 1 million years to see levels that were near 400 parts per million. And that means that every single one of us, all of our families, the entire human species, as well as all the plants, animals, and all the organisms that we rely on, the ecosystem services that we rely on, and these animals and plants rely on, they all have a very, very long evolutionary history of low CO2 concentrations, below 400 parts per million. And so suddenly in the last few decades, we've flown past that mark, and now we have all of the CO2 in the atmosphere, other greenhouse gases, and of course, as a consequence, we're seeing increasing temperatures and other abiotic changes. These are data from Starkville, Mississippi. I keep meaning to fix this figure because it has Fahrenheit on the y-axis and Celsius on other places. But the message is the same, and the details aren't that important. The point here is that temperatures are increasing. It's happening in Starkville, Mississippi, where I live, and it's probably happening where you're at. It's happening all over the globe. Things are getting warmer. The reason we're worried about this is because plants and animals and other organisms are really affected by their abiotic environment. We can conceptualize how the abiotic environment affects any species with these curves, like this one in the bottom. Usually we do it for temperature, and we think of it, or we call it a temperature performance curve. The idea being that there's a gradient from say cold to hot, or any, it doesn't have to be temperature, but from low to high. And along that gradient, there'll be some optimum, right? It'll increase from being a very bad level to being a very good level, and then back down to being a very bad level. So if this was, growth rate or reproduction, flying speed, predation rates, there's going to be some level at which it's too cold or too low for that behavior, that trait to occur. There'll be an optimum, and then there's going to be some value where it's too high for that to occur, and that's going to affect organisms. Now, no animal, no plant, none of us live in isolation. And so if we affect even one individual or one organism by changing some aspect of the environmental conditions, that can generate indirect effects that go up to other species. And so if we think about this with plants and herbivores, if plants are affected by increasing temperature, well, that could indirectly affect herbivores, and that could indirectly affect predators. And this is how most climate change research progressed through the 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s. if we could understand how plants are going to respond to climate change, that'll allow us to predict and understand how herbivores, predators, and so forth will also be affected. This idea, of course, is common in ecology, this idea that bottom up is most important. It has deep roots in ecology. And I really like this quote from the book Climate Change Biology, edited by several people, including Jonathan Newman, who was at Guelph at the time. Perhaps some of you know him. And they wrote in this book, climate change is largely, if not entirely, a bottom-up process. And I've got blacked out here a key part of the sentence that makes me very proud, where they say, but see Barton et al. 2009. That was work from my dissertation, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Jonathan actually visited me down in Mississippi, and I said to him, I'm not upset about being a but see also. I think it's great. What I'm upset about is you only cited one of my papers, because we've shown this, and it's not just us, but many people have shown that this just isn't true. And that's one of the main things I want you to leave here with, is understanding that these ecosystems aren't just driven by the plants, but it's also the predators down onto the plants. And we've published paper after paper. Of course, we're not the first one, and this wasn't the first one, but one of my favorite papers, Voigt et al. In 2003, showing with this really impressive data set that predators are really sensitive to changes in the environment. And when the environment changes, so do the predators, and that can generate these indirect effects down on lower trophic levels. And that is essentially the framework for much of the work we do, to look at how these predators respond, both in abundance and in behavior, and then how does that affect herbivores and subsequently the plants below them. So that's a bit of a background on climate change and predators. I want to give you some specific examples of involving warming and predator behavior, and emphasizing really the behavioral responses of predators and how they can happen very quickly to mediate these effects. So before I get into some of the details, because we have studied this in a lot of different systems, lady beetles and spiders. We'll talk about those predators later in the talk. We recently published a paper on wolves. It wasn't related to climate change, but I used to study trophic cascades with raccoons. Before we get into any of these details about all these predators that you may or may not be that familiar with, I want to start with a predator that each and every one of us we can relate to a little better. Bow hunters. I know that everybody who is watching this isn't a hunter, but I think you can probably relate to being a human being a little bit better than you can relate to being a spider or a lady beetle. So why are we talking about bow hunters? Humans are the biggest source of predation for elk. So we hear things about wolves killing elk, but humans kill way more than wolves ever do. In Idaho, this is a map of Idaho where I'm from. If you're not familiar with where Idaho it is, this is on the far side of the states. Up there at the top where it says Panhandle, that little bit touches British Columbia. So this is the northwest part of the U.S. and this is where I'm from. Now, people will often comment. You often hear people say things, if you grow up in Idaho like I did, that the weather really affects elk hunting. People will say things like, it's not worth going hunting because it's going to be too hot, or if it gets really cold, they might want to go for different reasons. And it seems a bit like lore, just old folklore of hunters telling stories about how the weather influences their hunting. And I got curious about this because I grew up around it, but then I'm also interested in how climate affects predator-prey interactions. And that's what this is, right? Elmer Fudd here is a predator, and he's attacking a prey, an elk. Now, Idaho does a really good job at keeping track of hunting data. Each of these little units, one of them I've got highlighted here in red, is the McCall Elk Zone. For each of those units, they keep track of how many people hunted, so how many licenses were sold, but also how many days those people went, if they got an animal or not, and a whole host of other information. So I took that data set and I paired it with some remotely sensed data that I got from folks at the University of Wisconsin when I was a postdoc. They were able to use this satellite-derived data to figure out what the actual temperature was in this weird-shaped elk zone polygon for each day of the elk season. And so by merging those two data sets, I was able to ask the question, how does temperature affect elk hunters, the behavior of this predator that's attacking this prey. What I found was that the warmer it was, hunters went hunting fewer days. And so there's a lot of variation, but it's still a pretty striking trend. The warmer it is, the fewer hunters go hunting. And this came about from two ways. The first was a numerical effect. In warmer years, there were just fewer licenses sold. So that's a reduction in the predator abundance, a numerical effect. But there was also a behavioral effect, right? So those hunters that did buy licenses in warm years, they actually went hunting fewer days. And so the total number of predators on the landscape in warm years was reduced. As a consequence, in warm years, elk harvest also was reduced. So warming was indirectly benefiting elk by reducing predator activity. Right? There was a behavioral response. The predators weren't active on the landscape, and so the elk benefited. Now, you might be thinking, that's a pretty special case. Humans aren't tied to the food they get through hunting. There's alternative food resources. They can go to the grocery store, they can go to McDonald's. They don't have to kill that animal to eat. That's true, but we find over and over again that if we look at other systems, we find a very similar pattern, that predators are affected by temperature, they change their behavior, and when they change their behavior, it has effects on the prey. In fact, that's exactly what I found in this spider grasshopper system, that these spiders, which couldn't be much more different than a human hunter, are responding the same way. The warmer it gets, the less active they become, and that indirectly affects the prey. And what's really neat about working with these insect systems, or these arthropod systems, is we can do mesocosm experiments, and we can track the effects to lower trophic levels. And this is the work I want to tell you about now. We've actually moved beyond sort of correlation with big data sets, but actual experimental evidence that changes in the environment affect predator behavior in ways that affect herbivore behavior and then affect plant communities. This work, as I mentioned, started as a PhD student, so I really need to acknowledge Osh Schmitz, my PhD advisor at Yale. And this figure here, this image is a map, an aerial photo, I guess, of the Yale forest in northeastern Connecticut, which is in the northeastern USA. And if you look in this image, you'll see a gap in the trees. That's this old field system where the native grasses and plants, I'll show you some more of that in a moment, where they've came back. But if you look really closely, you'll see a bunch of little kind of white colored dots, some of them in a grid arrangement. And those were our mesocosms. Google Earth actually has photos of our mesocosms in these fields. So these fields are really pleasant places to be in the summer, really beautiful, lots of diversity. You can see lots of different types of forbs and grasses growing in this image. What's interesting though, and the reason we study it, is that diversity is largely maintained by interaction between a few species. So first, goldenrod, this is Solidago rugosa. It's a really competitively dominant species that will reduce plant community evenness. Basically, this species will choke out all the other ones and we'll end up with monocultures of goldenrod. But that doesn't really happen because of interactions between these two species. This spider, Picerina mira, which is an ambush predator that hides in the plants and jumps out and attacks grasshoppers. And then this grasshopper, Melanopus femorubrum, the red-legged grasshopper, is a generalist herbivore. And that herbivore eats the goldenrod and suppresses it. Let me show you how that happens. When spiders aren't around, grasshoppers would much rather eat grasses than the forbs. They prefer the grasses. And they do a lot of damage on these grasses. So if we set up enclosures that don't have spiders, the grasshoppers eat the grasses, they suppress them, and forbs like goldenrod take off. The goldenrod ultimately will crowd out everything and leave the system as a monoculture. When the spider is actually present, so actually do these things in cages, put a spider into the mesocosm, and then wait and see what happens. the spider causes the grasshopper to change its behavior. The grasshopper starts eating more of the forbs. In particular, they go after the goldenrod, which has a lot of carbohydrates. And they start craving these carbohydrates for a host of reasons when they're threatened by predation risk. And when they suppress that goldenrod, all the other plants benefit and diversity increases. And that was work that was done well before my time as a graduate student. But what I started noticing was that there seemed to be some effect of temperature. I looked at all of these experiments that had been done over the years and found that the warmer it was, the stronger these effects were. So in cool years, the spider didn't really benefit the plants at all. But in really warm years, the spiders had really big effects. And so you can see in these two figures that in the warmer years, spiders had a strong positive effect on grasses. That's the indirect interaction strength. Basically, there was more grasses because of spiders. And in the warm years, there were fewer of the forbs, fewer of the goldenrod plants, less biomass, and so ultimately higher diversity. Now, the reason we're interested in this, of course, is because of climate change. If temperature is affecting the interactions between these predator and prey and restructuring the plant community, what's going to happen in the future? These are data from Storrs, Connecticut. It's an amazing data set that goes back over 100 years. And you can see quite clearly, although again, there's variation from year to year, there's a strong trend, a significant trend of increasing temperatures in Storrs, Connecticut during this growing season. So I started doing a lot of experiments where I'd look at the behaviors of grasshoppers and spiders in these mesocosms. These are just, I won't get bogged down with many of the methods, but some pictures to show you what this looks like. These little cages on tabletops, we could stock them full of plants, sod basically cut from the field, and then put grasshoppers in them. We could put spiders in some of them to see how the grasshopper behavior changes with and without the spider, and then using infrared heat lamps, elevate the temperature of these enclosures and see how warming affects the way they interact. What I found was that temperature actually had no direct effect on grasshoppers. No matter what the temperature was, grasshoppers fed about the same amount across these different temperatures. So feeding time was invariant across temperature. But that was only true when the predator was absent. When the predators were added, these spiders were put in the cages, there was a positive effect. So suddenly, warming temperatures led to more feeding, whereas warming temperatures had no effect when the spider was absent. It took a lot of brainstorming, but we finally figured out what was going on. There's a temperature gradient in these plants. At the top of the plants, where the sun is beating down, it's quite warm. As you move down lower in the plant canopy, these plants can be nearly a meter tall or so. So as you move down, it gets cooler, it's shaded, it's more humid. And the spiders are using that temperature gradient to thermoregulate. When they get too hot, they can move down. And when they get too cold, they can move up. So we realized this by looking at these data here, that grasshoppers, it turns out, don't really care what the temperature is. They stay high where the plant tissue is growing. It's relatively young tissue. It's easily digestible. It's nutritious. And so they stay relatively high at the tips of the plants and feed up there. And they don't care what the temperature is. You also think about a grasshopper. They're a tough organism. They have a thick, waxy cuticle and hard exoskeleton. They're not really prone to desiccation. Spiders, on the other hand, are a little more sensitive. These spiders, these predators, don't like the heat. If you think about a spider, they don't have that same thick cuticle and that same exoskeleton that prevents desiccation that a grasshopper does. And so if things get hot, the spider actually moves lower in the plant canopy. And what this does is it separates the spider from the grasshopper. Suddenly the grasshopper is no longer at risk of being consumed by the spider, and the grasshopper is free to feed more. And that explains why we see increasing temperatures that increase feeding rates of the grasshopper, because the risk has been reduced. The next question was, if we allow the grasshoppers to feed more, if warming is reducing risk and allowing them to feed more, does that mean that they control the goldenrod that's this competitively dominant species? And we did an experiment 3 years in these larger enclosures where we warmed temperatures about 2.5 degrees. And we found indeed reduced goldenrod biomass. So increased feeding was allowing the grasshoppers to suppress goldenrod and increase diversity or evenness. So what we find is that these predators are mediating everything. They are heat sensitive. They can't handle the heat. And so when they thermoregulate behaviorally, it changes the landscape of risk for the grasshopper. The grasshopper then changes its feeding habits and reduces this goldenrod and allows plant diversity to increase. So here are two examples that couldn't be much more different. We've got Elmer Fudd and some elk, and we've got spiders and grasshoppers, but the same basic principle holds true. Warming temperatures are changing the behavior of predators in ways that impact lower trophic levels. So I want to tell you now about some other aspects of global change. I showed you this figure already. These are data from Storrs, Connecticut. Again, this is where the grasshopper and spider work had been done. And I showed you that mean temperature has been increasing. But the thing about means are that the risk of a bad joke, they don't mean much at all. Because if we look at the maximum temperature, it hasn't changed. It hasn't become hotter at all in Storrs, Connecticut over the last century or so. But what it has become is less cool. So lower temperatures are driving this average effect. In other words, nighttime temperatures and winter temperatures are increasing a lot. Daytime temperatures and summer temperatures, not so much. It's becoming less cool, and that increases the mean. It's not necessarily becoming hotter, right? The days aren't getting hotter. And this has some really important implications. Everything I've told you so far is that increasing temperatures could push an animal past its thermal optimum, right? So these are those temperature performance curves I mentioned earlier. And if we have an animal that's near its optimum, we increase the temperature, it's bad for it. And so the spider has to move low to thermoregulate. But if temperatures are actually increasing from the bottom or increasing from the lows, it's a whole different scenario. In this case, we have low temperatures increasing towards the optimum, which means that predators might become actually more active and have more risk on the system. So I've become interested in this question of, does the timing of warming matter? And we studied this at the Yale Forest by watching spiders and grasshoppers in enclosures that were illuminated by red light. Now this image has a flash just so you could see everything, but basically these experiments would be conducted in almost pitch black with just a little red light, which didn't seem to affect the arthropods. Every 30 minutes I would record what they were doing for 24 hours straight. Really, really tedious work, but a really cool and insightful data set. These figures look a little different than what I showed you already, but it's the same general idea. Here we see grasshoppers and spiders represented as these box plots. The darker ones are grasshoppers and the white boxes are spiders. And you can see that daytime warming, which is that reddish colored square, causes the spider to move down, and that means that the predator and prey are now separated. The contrast is at night. Night warming actually increases spatial overlap with the predator and prey. So at nighttime, spiders will often move down into the leaf litter where the ground is warmer and they can be more comfortable. But as we warm temperatures, and you can see this on warm nights or when we used a heat lamp to increase the temperature of these mesocosms, those spiders actually become more active. They're up and active and hunting. Interestingly, grasshoppers also can feed at night. And so this risk that is now being imposed on the grasshoppers at night might influence the actual herbivory, patterns of herbivory in the ecosystem. And in fact, if we take the 24-hour feeding time of day warming grasshoppers versus nighttime warming grasshoppers, you can see that grasshoppers exposed to day warming fed almost twice as much as grasshoppers exposed to night warming. And it's because of risk. Again, day warming makes things less risky, so they can feed more. Night warming makes things more risky, so they have to feed less. And I kind of tricked you a little bit. I was a little dishonest about this experiment. I showed you already these large enclosures that ran for 3 years. we had both day warming and nighttime warming treatments. And so previously I showed you the data that showed that the grasshoppers fed more and therefore reduced goldenrod. That was the day warming. In the night warming, the opposite happened. Grasshoppers fed less and we ended up with more goldenrod. And as a consequence, in night warming treatments, diversity or evenness was reduced. So daytime and nighttime warming have very, very different consequences for that system. I wanted to know if it affected other systems similarly, and so that was a question that was tackled by Corey Spates. I should say now Dr. Corey Spates. She graduated in the spring, and I have not updated this slide clearly. But Corey took on this question in a different system that we work in, lady beetles, aphids, and then agricultural plants. During my postdoc, I started working with this system, looking at how ladybugs or lady beetles control aphids and then subsequently affect alfalfa, soybean, and corn plants. So Corey worked with a thing called the multicolored Asian lady beetle. They're very common in North America. Although they are invasive, they're really important agents of biological control. They eat aphids. The aphids are also invasive. These things can eat so many aphids that farmers don't have to spray as many chemicals. Certainly farmers still spray chemicals, but undoubtedly without many of these lady beetles, including Harmonia axaritis, we would be spraying more chemicals. And so they're really a good thing even though they're invasive. Corey would raise these things in growth chambers that had 4 different treatments: ambient, constant warm, so basically warm the same during the day and night, and then a day warming treatment and a night warming. All of the warming treatments, the average temperature was the same. It was just the timing that the warming occurred, either constantly or just in the day or just in the night. She followed these things from hatching all the way to adulthood to see how the timing of warming mattered for these predators. Now, if you don't know, I got to show you this image. This is a baby ladybug. This is a larval lady beetle. You may see them on plants feeding on aphids and not know what they are. But this little guy will end up pupating and then turning into what we know, most folks know, as a ladybug. Corey found that there was a lot of effects on lady beetles, or a lot of different effects between daytime and nighttime warming. So daytime warming reduced hatching success. It changed the development time, so how long they remained as larval instars. It changed their predation rates. It changed their respiration rates. And so these treatments, they matter. The timing really does matter for these predators. She also did experiments with plants alone, plants with aphids, and then plants with aphids and the predator. And the idea here was to understand if predators in these different treatments could maintain their role as biological control agents and actually benefit plants. And so what you see is in the first sort of set of data, the P trophic level, so plant only, and then you move to the pH, which is plant plus herbivore, you can see everything goes down. The plant biomass, which is on the y-axis, decreases when you have the herbivore, the aphid. But what you'll notice, and it's a little hard to see, and I'll show you some lines to help out in a second, on the next one, predators are added, so plants, herbivores, and predators. What we would expect to see is those predators to actually suppress the aphids and cause the plant biomass to go back up. That would be a trophic cascade. That would give evidence that the predators were indirectly benefiting the plants. But in this case, you see that only in the night warming treatment do we find evidence of a trophic cascade. In the other treatments, the predators aren't actually benefiting the plants. And so again, the way we warm these experiments, or the way climate change happens, whether it's from daytime warming or nighttime warming, can completely change the net outcome for the ecosystem, or in this case, the plants. So in both of these systems, again, you can see that daytime warming and nighttime warming had very different effects. And then those predators, by responding in different ways, generate indirect effects through the ecosystem. And so getting this right really matters if we want to understand how climate change is affecting ecosystems. Here's the problem. A few years ago, I reviewed a lot of papers, ended up being 87 studies. There were terrestrial, food web, predator-prey warming experiments. So the end result was 87 different experiments that I reviewed. Of all of those, only a single paper, only one study used nighttime warming. All of these studies that we have are doing daytime warming, and yet nighttime warming is a really common phenomenon. And if the work we've done is correct, and these ideas are right, we're completely getting it wrong. So Corey did another analysis. She ended up looking at thousands of papers, and I forget exactly. I think the N database had a couple hundred different papers in it, but she was able to look at what people have been doing since my review in 2017. So she found that nighttime warming is expected for a third of Earth during the growing season. So nighttime warming is pretty stinking common, even though daytime warming might be the most common. The problem is we have a real extreme bias in where we do studies. This is again from her database where she looked at where warming experiments are conducted, and you can see the United States and Canada, parts of Asia and Europe have done experiments on how warming affects these food webs. The rest of the world we don't know much about. Coincidentally, the places we've done these experiments, like the United States and much of Europe, are places where we are seeing day warming. And so the good news is that where we've done some of these experiments, the treatments are accurate, and we actually have learned probably something about those systems. The problem then is it's not very easy to just assume what we've learned in the United States applies to places where there's been nighttime warming. So how we can transfer our understanding of warming effects from one place to another is really complicated because this nuance in whether the site is experiencing daytime warming or nighttime warming. I've been trying to encourage people to do nighttime warming studies. We did a review recently about ways to do nighttime warming experiments and why people aren't doing them. I'd encourage you to look at it. Most studies are done through passive warming. If you think about most research isn't done at a nice field site that has electricity. We're doing these experiments out in fields, and we're having to use the sun's energy to create warming, and that means that we only warm during the day. So the answer, of course, are things like electric heaters where we can actually warm, and I was encouraged to think that maybe some field stations were starting to put in things like this, and was hoping to talk to you guys about that. Maybe we'll say that for another year. But if we had electricity in fields, we could actually do these warming experiments the right way. There's a lot more to climate change than just warming, and that's what I focused on here, but it's not what I want to end with. There's part of that review that I did in 2017 on the effects of climate change on food webs revealed that most of our studies, 69% of them, are on temperature. And there's a lot of other kinds of climate change and other parts of global change that we're completely ignoring. And so I want to share with you some of our efforts recently to understand more about these other aspects of global change and how they affect predator-prey interactions. This is a picture I took in Wisconsin when I was a postdoc. This is not an abnormally windy day in Wisconsin. Wisconsin can be windy, and this is a soybean field that's being blown around dramatically by the wind. And here we have one of those lady beetles, Harmonia axaritis, trying to do its job. It's trying to feed on soybean aphids, control those aphids. But wind might be impacting its ability to do so. Turns out wind speeds have actually been decreasing. This is not a widely known phenomenon that we've had. It's called global stilling over the last several decades, 5 to 15% reduction in wind speeds over the last 30 years. The people that have studied this are people interested in where to build wind farms, and so a lot of modeling has been implemented to understand where on the landscape is windy, where it's not windy, where are reliable winds, and where are they disappearing, so you don't invest a lot of money into wind energy just to have the wind go away. And again, as a result of this research, we've learned that wind speeds are decreasing, but we don't know much about the consequences of wind for predator-prey interactions or food webs. We did this study in 2014. We actually built wind blocks to study how wind affects ladybugs and aphids. So here you see a picture of a wind block over a plot of soybean in Wisconsin. The short version of this is that wind makes it difficult for predators to hunt. And so when there's a wind block, the predators actually were attracted. They like those spots. When they're being blown around, like that picture I showed you a moment ago, it's really difficult to hunt. It's difficult to find prey. It's difficult to move around on those stems. And so the predators avoid those areas. And since the predators are attracted when there's less wind, there's actually fewer aphids. So they're eating more of those aphids. There's a little bit more to it than that, but what I want to move on to and share with you is that this could also have implications beyond just climate change, but other things we do in the environment that affect wind. Drones, for example, have absolutely exploded. We have hundreds of thousands, millions of drones in the US alone that are flying around doing things like, maybe one day delivering our packages. What are the implications of that for food webs and for ecosystems? We did a study a couple of years ago that's in prep where we flew drones over potted plants, soybean plants in buckets. And we looked at how it affected the aphid abundance and the predator abundance. And what happens is that those drones scare away predators. The predators leave. They don't want to be buzzed by a windy drone every day. And so the aphid abundance increases. And ultimately, I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, we were able to show that drones could reduce soybean yield. Actually, soybean plants were smaller and produced less yield when drones had flown over them every day because they had more of these pests on them. So there's a few examples from our work on how changes in the environment, humans doing things in the environment, are affecting the interactions of predators and their prey and causing these cascading effects down to lower trophic levels. These examples are pretty stinking diverse. Elmer fudd, grasshoppers, aphids and lady beetles. The same thing seems to hold true for temperature, for drones, for wind. It seems to be a relatively consistent result in finding that these predators are very sensitive to changes in the environment. And as we try to understand how climate change and global change will affect ecosystems, we need to keep a special eye on these predators and what they do and how they transmit those effects. When I give these talks, and I just every day in my office, and I think about the work we're doing and what we're trying to understand, it gets a little bit it gets you down, because you realize that pretty much everything we do can have some impact that can be transmitted through a food web or through an ecosystem. And so everything we do seems to have these cascading effects if you look hard enough, which is really, it's hard to deal with sometimes because it makes you want to give up sometimes. And it reminds me of this quote of Aldo Leopold. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that you live alone in a world of wounds. And he was talking about how, the more we look and we start to understand what humans are doing, the more we see that we're causing these problems. I like to think about it a little more positively, that we're highlighting some of these problems and highlighting the issues of things like drones before they become a big problem. And hopefully someone's listening and will go, maybe we should step back and think of ways to mediate those or mitigate those effects. Now, the other thing is, I don't like to end on such a somber note. I don't want to end with such a sort of a downer of a conclusion that everything we do is negative to the environment. And so I want to tell you about one more study we did that I'm quite proud of, but came from a really, really unexpected source of inspiration. Well, unfortunately, this violated some of YouTube's rules, so I had to remove the audio, but I think many of you will recognize this song. So hopefully you guys recognize Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, the last track on AC/DC's very, very, very famous album, Back in Black. I was actually driving home one day from work, and the song came on, and it hit me suddenly. Rock and roll ain't noise pollution. That's a testable hypothesis. Rock and roll ain't noise pollution, and the alternative, of course, is that rock and roll is noise pollution. And of course, I don't study noise pollution, or I hadn't at that point, but I realized that this might be a really interesting way to understand more about how sound and noise affects food webs. Why would we be interested in that? Well, it turns out that sound is really one of the next big areas that we're trying to understand its implications for ecosystems and species interactions. We know very little about it, frankly, even though it's a really pervasive and common disturbance, especially in urban areas, but also in really wild areas. It's impressive that even in national parks and preserved areas, you can go there and still be inundated by sound, the sound of airplanes and cars going by. It's still very common, even in wild areas. And so we're interested in understanding how sound affects food webs. And to do this, we had some fun with it, and we played AC/DC to lady beetles and aphids in growth chambers and looked at their interactions. And so I want to show you a short video. So these lady beetles and aphids and plants were exposed to AC/DC for 24 hours. And we didn't just do AC/DC, we did a bunch of other bands as well. But what we were able to find was that loud music like rock and roll, like AC/DC, and also city noise, it reduced the feeding rates of these predators. When we blasted them with loud sounds, they ate less. But if we played Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash, it didn't seem to have a big effect. But so AC/DC and this rock music actually reduced feeding rates, and that allowed the aphids, surprisingly, to increase in abundance. They were not affected by the sounds. And as a consequence, we're actually able to discover that AC/DC reduced soybean yield by changing this biological control. Now you might think, why in the world would we do something like this? And there are a few reasons. First, as I said, sound pollution is becoming a big issue and people are really concerned about it, yet we know very little about it. The studies that have been done are often the direct effects and often on vertebrates. So there's very little known about how insects are being affected and then how they can transmit these indirect effects. But probably most important was this was extremely popular with the media and really captivated people's attention in a way that let us reach a new audience. And it was great to be, again, I was actually sitting at the cottage in Algonquin on the phone with people in Australia and in England, across the world, sharing with them this message that predators are really important. And as we change the environment, we're impacting them in really unfortunate ways, and so reaching that new audience was of course fantastic. So let me wrap up and just remind you of what I'm hoping you left here with. Predators mediate a lot of things. Predators are really important, and they have cascading effects down on lower trophic levels, and climate change is far from a bottom-up only phenomenon. It is absolutely having effects on predators, and those effects are going down to lower trophic levels. It's also more than just warming. It's not just that things are getting warmer on average, but the way things are warming has huge implications for the net impacts of warming. And so we have to get this right, and I hope that anybody that's interested in warming experiments will take this to heart and think carefully about the way they do those experiments so that we're generating information that's actually representing reality and helping predict the net effects of climate change. And also that there's a lot more than warming that's changing in our world. Temperature is certainly a big factor, but so is changing precipitation, light pollution, snow cover, wind, sound pollution. All of these things are affecting ecosystems, and more importantly is that they're also interacting, and we know almost nothing about how temperature, wind, sound, and all of these things interact to shape ecosystems. Finally, I also want to remind you that it's okay to have a little fun. You know, we do some serious work, some important work, and it's often an uphill battle, and it's not always that rewarding. So when you have the chance, you know, make sure you take a little time to smile and celebrate the little things. Wish I was there right now to meet you all and have a good time, but maybe another time. Let me just leave with this and say, if anyone ever wants to talk about this stuff, I'd be happy to. You can email me or follow me on Twitter and the Lab Instagram account. if you're interested. Thank you all, and stay well.